one of the ways we can prepare ourselves is by recognizing the huge opportunities, actually, that migration brings to the luckier parts of the world which are safer. At the moment, the industrialized northern countries are facing an absolutely immense demographic crisis. We're not having enough babies to support our aging population. The birth rate has absolutely plummeted.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Gaia Vince, an award-winning science writer and author. She is particularly interested in the interaction between human systems and Earth's planetary systems. Her research has taken her around the world. In today's episode, we discuss Gaia's book, Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. We are already at 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, with significantly more to come. The four horsemen of the Anthropocene, fire, heat, drought, and flood, will lead to human migration on an unprecedented scale. Gaia describes what we must do, individually and collectively, to prepare. It is my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Gaia Vince. Gaia Vince, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, Leslie.
I brought you on because I read your book, Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. And perhaps saying I enjoyed it would be it was a good book. It is well researched. It is well written. I learned a lot from it, and I liked all of those things about it. But it paints a picture of a world that I think we are heading to, and I wish we weren't. So I'd like to start with the premise of the book. What is the Nomad Century, and why have you decided to call it that?
Yeah, well, we are at the moment, as I'm speaking to you, we've just had a year where the average global temperature was 1.6 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. So, we're used to hearing keep 1.5 alive. We have to keep below 1.5 degrees. Well,
right, and I believe the Paris Accord was well below, which was not defined, but well below 1.5 degrees.
Well, it was to keep below 2 degrees by the end of the century, and to aim to keep below 1.5. But we've exceeded that, and we are continuing to emit carbon dioxide at a phenomenal record. And we haven't hit peak emissions yet, let alone declining. So when you look ahead at the coming decades, if you look at the climate models, we're on a trajectory to hit quite easily somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And what that means is that large swathes of the planet will become increasingly unlivable. I mean, we already have places that are, essentially unlivable for certain times of the year, some kind of year round. So, I mean, while we're talking, we have fires in Los Angeles that have made, tens of thousands of people climate refugees. Essentially, we've just seen on our television screens the wealthiest climate refugees that you'll ever see.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, a couple of dozen people have died. But if you compare, and that's been all over the news, all over our screens, all over the front pages for at least the last week. But if you compare that to the current situation in other parts of the world, take Somalia, for instance. There is the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya, which is, hosts more than 300,000 refugees. Largely, the majority are climate refugees because of terrible, terrible drought across the Horn of Africa, which means that people are literally starving. And that is essentially a prison. So people are trapped there because they had the misfortune to be born somewhere which is afflicted with terrible drought. So these are places which are essentially unlivable at the moment. But as we continue down the century, we're going to see large parts of the world become increasingly unlivable, and that's going to force people to move. And so that's why I call it the kind of the nomad century, because we're going to see this sort of we're already seeing it's already underway, this movement. And it's not just of people, it's a movement of wealth, of capital, of industry, of expertise, of agriculture, of resources. Everything is going to shift north because the human climate niche is shifting north. And so this century is a huge upheaval. It's an upheaval in our climate, but also in exactly, where we live. If we ourselves are not moving, I mean, you're talking to me from Canada, which has spent, at least the last 2 years, more or less on fire, and these huge Earth systems don't respect the imaginary lines we draw on borders. The plumes from the fires burning in Canada travel thousands of kilometers across the ocean and are affecting the health of people living in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The fires burning right now, and of course in New York State and places like that are closer, but the fires burning right now in LA will be felt, depending on where the wind blows, for many kilometers as well, and will, affect people's health dramatically. And so, when we talk about the movement that comes as our planet, if we look at it as a sphere, as a ball in space, and we look at those Earth systems, fire or heat or drought or river flows, we see these rivers in full flood, as we had just a few months ago through Europe. That river doesn't sort of stop at the Czech border and say, oh, I don't have a permit, I don't have a visa for Poland, I'm not going to. Of course not. They're cross-border because that's how it works. And that's how human systems work as well. I mean, when you look at the fires in LA, we see, no matter the political rhetoric, we're seeing streams of firefighters coming to help from Mexico, right? We're seeing Canadian planes helping fight the fires. We're seeing actually planes from much further afield coming to help in the effort, because human systems are also cross-border, but we are doing our best to sort of stop that. So in our minds, we think of ourselves as sedentary, as staying in one city, but actually we're not. And this century will show, with the movements that are already underway in Earth systems in the natural world, that it is a century. It is the nomad century.
So one major theme of your book is that people, I mean, essentially it's the increase in temperatures of the climate and the climate intensification. Dry places will get much, much drier. Wet places will get much, much wetter. Like, we need a certain amount of water. Zero water is bad, but floods are also very bad, very destructive to human homes and to agriculture and communities. And to say nothing of winds, hurricanes that will just devastate entire areas. But the main thesis of your book is that while a certain amount of that, and by a certain amount I mean a lot, is baked in, we can make it less worse. But there's the assumption is that we're already at, as you noted, 1.6 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and we aside from a slight dip during the COVID pandemic, carbon dioxide emissions are only ever increasing. And so there's probably going to be a lot more, unfortunately, than 1.6 degrees that we have to cope with. And so people are going to move away from places where they can no longer live. So you mentioned that there are essentially four factors. I believe you called them the four horsemen of climate change. The four horsemen of the Anthropocene, I think was the title of your chapter. So, given that a lot of climate change, of climate intensification, of global warming is inevitable, and let's just acknowledge that we should do everything we can to minimize it, but a certain amount is going to be there that's going to have major impacts. What are the four horsemen of the Anthropocene that we can, I was about to say look forward to, but really that we need to anticipate and plan for, and it's not even the coming decades, it's the coming months, the coming years.
Yeah, so I really identify these four things that cause people to move because where they live is unlivable, and they are fire, flood, heat, and drought, and these things either affect us physically. Heat is deadly. It kills actually tens of thousands of people just in Europe each year. The extreme heat that we've been experiencing over the past few years. Um, Drought is the biggest problem for agriculture, and when agriculture is hit, we feel it here in the cost of living crisis. The food prices go up, but across the global south, it's causing actual starvation or hunger. All the way from Sudan to Mali. And then floods, they are devastating for infrastructure, and again for agriculture. And people drown frequently in floods. And fire, the same thing. So essentially, what we're doing when we pump more carbon emissions into the atmosphere is we're heating it up and we're infusing the atmosphere with a lot more energy. And that is what is driving these much stronger hurricanes and storms, and the power that they have. And hotter air, of course, holds more moisture. So then we're getting these flash floods, these devastating, hurricanes used to be a problem because of the force of the wind, knocking down buildings and so on. But now, a lot of the damage, that we saw in Storm Ellen, for example, was not actually from the wind force, that energy. It was from the floods, from the precipitation that was scooped up, in that storm event and dumped, and that is something that is very, very hard to adapt to. So we're seeing that, and what we're seeing increasingly is these cascading events where one thing then leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. Like, for example, Pakistan in 2022 had they had months and months of unbearable heat. Temperatures in the mid to late 40s degrees Celsius, and then following and ruinous drought, which hit harvests and yields. And then following that, they had these devastating floods, this precipitation that landed and left 33 million people displaced within just 1 week. And then following the floods, which washed away a lot of buildings and infrastructure, which had been, the foundations had been weakened by the shrinkage that occurs with drought, when that soil kind of shrinks away from the foundations of bridges and other infrastructure. They were weakened, and then there were the landslides. So it's one thing after another, right? So the floods then caused this erosion event, which caused landslides, and the landslides then bury buildings and people and cars and roads. And it just means that recovery from these incidents is very, very hard because you don't have access to the place, and it's very dangerous to enter. And when you get there, there's kind of no resources, there's no food, there's no sanitation, the power lines are down, all of these things. So it means that people are displaced for longer periods of time and multiply because of multiple events within the same nation, which is where most climate migrants are. They're displaced within their own nations. They become multiply displaced from one place to another as more and more things hit. I mean, I was talking earlier about the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, which has been, badly hit itself by drought. It's basically a desert now, and it's people subsist entirely on United Nations rations. Uh, they had this devastating flood that suddenly came, because these extreme conditions move and then suddenly hit somewhere, and because of shifts to different circulation patterns as we heat the atmosphere, you get these kind of sticky events. So instead of a heavy rainfall and precipitation lasting, hours or a couple of days, they can sit in one place for weeks and cause huge amounts of damage. And we've seen that. We've seen these heat domes that kind of squat over places. We saw one in Canada just a year or two ago, with temperatures in the 50s in Canada. I mean, really quite extraordinary.
Mhm.
And these sort of sticky weather patterns cause huge amounts of damage because although we can respond and adapt to short-term disasters, when they persist, we don't have the resilience for it, and we're not ready for it. So increasingly, what we are going to see is these extreme events making places unlivable, so that people are not just migrating within their nations, but they're also having to cross borders and in some cases cross continents. And when we look at the climate models for where these conditions are going to be most severe, and places that are going to be most unlivable because of these four horsemen of the Anthropocene, we're looking at a huge swathe across the tropics, essentially, which goes up, to the Great Lakes in the Americas and down into Patagonia, and most of the continent of Africa, up into, southern Europe. Already we see the south of Europe is already becoming unlivable. Like, Spain, the south of Spain is basically a desert, and parts of Portugal, Greece, Turkey, hit by wildfires constantly. And then across Asia, Central South Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is home to a third of the world's population. This is a really serious situation. Um, it doesn't, and then we're talking about coastlines, which, because of sea level rise, coastlines are already really dangerous places to live because of storm surges, erosion patterns, and so on. And river deltas, most of where our major cities in the world are located are actually becoming increasingly dangerous locations. And it doesn't mean that everybody will have to move, but it does mean that the area of livability within these bands is really shrinking, um, and those places will have to adapt. Everywhere will have to adapt, but those places specifically will have to adapt much, much more, in order to accommodate some populations. But it won't be the major, 20 billion, 30 billion who live in Mumbai currently, for example. You take Mumbai, it's got that many people. 9 million of them live in slum housing. These are little concrete boxes with corrugated iron roofs, where the temperature is already, 6 to 10 degrees above the temperature in the city proper. And, this is on the side of the ocean. It's on a coast, and it's inundated by storm surges, terrible sanitation, anyway, and disease. you know, Mumbai will still be there in 2040, 2060, but it will be a small, heavily adapted population. It cannot be 30 million people living there, cannot adapt to the conditions that are there. We've just seen with LA, people will still live in LA, but not the way that they have been living at the moment. That's just impossible. It's, you know, same with Miami. with New Orleans.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you just said, and I have about 70 questions I want to ask. But let's talk about adaptation.
I'm talking too much.
I remember about this. I remember at the not long after the Syrian civil war began, Angela Merkel, who was then the chancellor, the leader of Germany, welcomed approximately 1 million Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war, and this was not after a lot of planning. So Germany took in a million people suddenly, and it's a large and wealthy country, was physically completely unaffected by the Syrian civil war. But just the logistics of taking in a million people without rigorous planning beforehand was extremely difficult. There was nowhere at first to place all these people, and you had families living in gymnasiums and hallways because there wasn't the planning and nobody knew where to put them. And this lasted perhaps 6 months, 7 months, and then they solved the problem, but that took months with 1 million people. That was not planned in a place that was, from a geophysical perspective, completely intact. You mentioned 33 million people in Pakistan that were displaced in 1 week, in a region that was devastated by the environment. How One of the things that you mentioned a few times is that we are going to have to adapt. And I agree with that. But what's not clear, at least so far, is how can we adapt? Like, the numbers are so staggering, and the number of people that are going to be affected is, as you said, a third of the human population. Well, that's 8 billion people right now. So we're talking about 2.4 billion people over the next few years or couple decades that we're going to have to move because where they're living is unlivable or will become so. How do we adapt? How do we make this um, possible? Like that, the scale of that is just mind-boggling to me, and I'm hoping you can help me understand.
Yeah, I mean, this is no easy task, obviously. I mean, it's something we've never faced before. It is a planetary scale crisis. And it's not being seen as such. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was actually out of frustration that we're not talking about this and we're not planning for it and we're not solving the problem at all. So first of all, not all those people are going to arrive on our front doorstep saying, "Can I come in?" The problem actually is not too many people migrating. The problem is not enough people want to or will migrate, and so they will stay in danger. And whether or not they survive the coming decades is it's very risky. People will have to move to better adapted places, and we can do a lot about that. We still have huge amounts of choices. Um, First of all, we can prevent some of the warming that is ahead of us, some of this dreadful heating, by decarbonising much faster, than we are, and that means stopping polluting with fossil fuels and switching to renewable generation. But also, we can do a lot to adapt some of the worst hit places. Um, Nowhere is adapting nearly on the scale that we need to. And part of that is not having the resources to do it in poor countries. And we can do a lot to help with that. Um, and that will mean fewer people will have to move. When it comes to the people that do move, one of the ways we can prepare ourselves is by recognizing the huge opportunities, actually, that migration brings to the luckier parts of the world, which are safer. At the moment, the industrialized northern countries are facing an absolutely immense demographic crisis. We're not having enough babies to support our aging population. The birth rate has absolutely plummeted. It's below one child per couple in some parts of some countries like Korea, parts of Italy, and so on. In order to maintain population levels, each woman has to have 2.1 children, basically.
But do we really want to have like the same number of people? Like one of the factors that is driving the climate crisis is the ever increasing number of humans on the planet, which means more resources, more agriculture, more carbon emissions for to support 8 billion people. If we could, to me, if we're going to reduce the population, I don't know if that's a noble goal or not, but the best way to do that is a reduced birth rate rather than people starving or dying in natural disasters. Do you think that maintaining the population, currently roughly 8 billion people around the globe, or continuing to increase it, is a good thing?
Well, first of all, I would say that um, the correlation between population and carbon emissions is not quite right. If you look at where populations are falling, it's in the countries that are producing the most emissions. Um,
Right.
if you look at where people have the most children, it's in countries where they are pretty much contributing nothing to this carbon issue, but they are the most heavily impacted. Now, in terms of the population of the world is anyway, the population increase is declining, and we will probably reach peak population around the 2060s. And then global population is likely to fall towards the end of the century. Um, Now, in terms of, is population decline a good thing or a bad thing? I would say that in the most of the countries, the democratic north for sure, but in all countries, there is a sort of social contract whereby the young working age population pays for the care of the elderly and infirm. Now, that contract breaks down if what you have is people living longer with multiple morbidities and no one to look after them, no one to pay taxes because no one's working because there is such a shrinkage in the labour force. It means a massive crash in economic growth and standards of living. And I don't think that's something that many of us would want. And if we are going to go down that path, we will need to adapt much, much more rapidly for that kind of economy. And I can't imagine how we would do it, to be honest. The only way of maintaining any sort of living standards and maintaining um, our economies so that we can look after the elderly, so that we can restore our natural lands, the biodiversity that's also been lost, so that we can produce food and so on, is through immigration, right? That's the only proven way of bringing birth rates, of bringing population size back up. Um, and it seems to me that there are whole generations of people with huge potential and promise and innovative ideas and so much to offer, who are at the moment living through accident of birth in places that have been hit by disaster and so are completely trapped in terrible lives, sometimes literally in refugee prisons, in places where their potential is being massively thwarted. Um, so the tragedy that people have to leave their homes, you know, which is an utter tragedy, can be, we can find ways of making this movement less painful and more beneficial to migrants and to economies, to host populations, by re reimagining the idea of the nation, building much more inclusive, integrated cities with people from all around the world who have somewhere to live in safety, and to create those very adapted, uh, sustainable centers of human culture and flourishing opportunity.
Yeah. One of the statistics you mentioned in your book that kind of blew me away, because it was new to me, was that uh, you published the book in 2022, so 3 years ago, roughly, and you wrote that the 50 million climate displaced people already outnumber those fleeing political persecution. And we hear a lot about people being, fleeing a country because they're part of a disfavored minority, or they disagreed with the official government line on something or other. And there's no shortage of countries and people. But that even 3 years ago, climate displaced people outnumbered them. That astonished me. Uh, and
On top of
and the,
that, the people that are fleeing from conflict, climate is a threat multiplier, and many of these conflicts have climate as a massive contributor to
mhm.
the situation. Because when if you take somewhere like Sudan, when people don't have basic security over food, fresh water, um, their animals are dying and so on. They're much, much more, when they're not getting that met a by their leadership, they're much more susceptible to extremist groups who can promise them these things, and they're much more vulnerable, basically, to be drawn into conflicts, because they have, that it's not working for them. The world is not working for them as it is, and so we see many conflicts where drought, persistent chronic drought, hunger, um, these are strongly contributing factors to the situation they face.
Yes, and I would certainly agree with that. Um, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the political reality or political mood. Like in Canada, for example, we've always had a fairly consistent, reasonably high level of immigration every year, and Canadians have generally been quite in favor of that, recognizing the contribution that is made. Something has changed in the last, I don't know, perhaps 2 to 3 years. And uh, I'm not sure exactly what the cause is, but we ramped up the number of people coming into Canada, and uh, I'm not sure if there's a connection here, but it is a fact that over the last 10 to 15 years, housing prices, especially in our large cities, have become ludicrously high, uh, and the um, and the sentiment has changed, and the view of bringing more people, more having more immigration into Canada, uh, has turned negative. And even our prime minister has said that they erred on immigration policy, and it is backpedaling. Um, in the United States, the motto on the Statue of Liberty: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." I think it's safe to say, as we record this, the new administration has not yet been sworn in. By the time this airs, it will have been. But I think it's fair to say that that will not be the motto of the United States for the next 4 years. We're seeing a lot of backlash among the Northern European countries to large scale immigration from people that need to move. How can we serve the needs of the people that are fleeing places that are no longer habitable, while recognizing the mood and the wishes and desires of the populations of living in places that remain habitable and will continue to do so, at least to some extent, for the coming years and decades.
Yeah, well, so housing is a really important issue, and at the moment, many nations are failing their existing population in terms of housing, in terms of rolling out affordable housing. They're not building enough houses. They have problems with, zoning restrictions or whatever. It depends on the country. Um, to make migration work, first of all, we've got to acknowledge that migration is inevitable, is underway, it's already happening, right? So it's not negotiable. Migration is not kind of something we can just say, no, we're not having any more migrants, send them away. Or whatever, the populist leader says, that's just, it's not reality. People will still come because they have to, they have no choice. So once you accept that, you start thinking, well, how can you make it work? And essentially, in order to make immigration work, you need investment, short-term investment, because economically it will be more than repaid long term by the increased productivity of the economy, by the taxes paid by the new arrivals, their children, and so on. But short term, yes, it does require investment. It requires financial investment. And that means you do need to build enough houses so that there isn't conflict with the existing population, so that house prices don't rise dramatically. You need to ensure that there is enough access to healthcare. There are enough GPs. There are enough school places that the infrastructure can cope. All of those things you need to invest financially um, in the short term. The other thing you need to do, and by the way, many leaders are not doing that for their existing population. So this is a policy choice that they've made, and it's got nothing to do with the immigrants. It's their failure, and it's very easy to blame migrants for policy failures. The other key sort of investment that needs to be made is the social investment. And that's something Canada has actually been good at compared to several nations. That idea that people who arrive are new Canadians. They're not some sort of subspecies from somewhere else. They're new Canadians.
Yes.
Well, you may laugh, but unfortunately, this is how some countries treat new arrivals.
Yeah. No, you're right, of course.
It's really shocking, thankfully, to people who are a bit more enlightened. But actually, in order to make it work, there does need to be that adjustment. There do need to be, in Canada, English or French lessons given. Language lessons, which again in many countries are not given, or you have to pay for them. There need to be some, cultural acquainting with the new nation. People need to feel included, part of the city, even if they have a different skin color or a different religion or wear different clothes or have a funny accent or whatever. They need to feel that they are part of the city, and the citizens living there need to feel that the new arrivals are part of the city. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And we've seen that in places that have been very, very generous, for example, to migrants, like Sweden has invested financially very well, but not socially. And so there is this kind of schism where new arrivals don't feel Swedish and Swedes don't think of them as Swedish. And so you have this sort of siloing, these separate communities living within the city, and it doesn't work like that. You have essentially different economies. You have a black market economy being set up. You have people who don't feel invested in the future of that city. So these two investments are really, really important. But plenty of places, like Toronto gets that right, in a way that London also gets that right. Not perfect, obviously, but compared to many places around the world, um, big cities which are focal points of immigration are generally much more open, welcoming, easier um, for migrants to succeed in, and for everybody to enjoy the riches. The places that are most anti-migrant and most vehemently opposed to migration are generally the places that never see any migrants. Migrants don't.
Right.
And what we're looking at there is it's an internal domestic social schism where these kind of post-industrial normally or rural towns feel left behind from the growth and the benefits that are occurring in more metropolitan mixed centres, and so they resent that, and they feel that they're being left behind in their own country, and they put that down to migration, among other things. And so this is what we saw in Brexit. This is what we see in the sort of Trump heartlands versus the Democrats. We see that everywhere, and that's something that really needs to be solved, because it's a huge problem in terms of everything from terrorism to so national security to productivity to just general contentment of citizens.
Uh, yeah, there's so many questions I want to ask. I want to ask about something else you wrote in your book. You wrote that there are at least 21 cities in India, including New Delhi, Chennai, Hyderabad, that will run out of groundwater by 2025. Well, that's you wrote this in 2022. We're now in 2025. We're not at the end of it, but we've started 2025. Is that prediction affecting 100 million people, or I don't know, 6-7% of the Indian population? Are we still on track for that?
I mean, it's absolutely dire. There are cities where they've essentially run out of water. They have tankers to come in selling water. It's terrible. Poor people have all sorts of skin conditions because the rationing of water is so severe. Hyderabad, you just mentioned, is one of those. It's a very, these are not small places. These are big,
Mm-hmm.
and it is absolutely dire.
Now, is this due to climate change as such? Or I know that there's a lot of places, at least in Canada and the United States, I don't know about India, but they're running out of groundwater not so much because of climate change, but because we have been pulling the water. I mean, these aquifers replenish themselves over time, but it's a slow process. And we have been sucking huge quantities, way like orders of magnitude greater than the replenishment rate out of the water for human consumptions, primarily for agriculture. And so it was inevitable that at some point, no matter how large the aquifer, it would run dry. As I said, I'm not familiar with India.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that what happened in India, or is it because of climate change and changing water patterns that they're running out of groundwater?
It's a combination of factors. One of the factors is that the Green Revolution, which dragged huge numbers of people out of abject poverty and famine, was helped by these new water pumps that could pull the water out of aquifers, and that meant that loads of places that were not able to grow crops prior were suddenly able to be, were producing crops, sometimes 3 different crops a year. They produced lots of water, but that's fossil water, and it wasn't being replenished. And those aquifers are running dry. So there's plenty of places where there's been completely inappropriate water use long term. And now they are, enormous numbers of people are dependent on these harvests, which are no longer being produced. So it's a huge problem. Now there have been, I've visited some projects in India. Actually, we're talking about Hyderabad, quite near to Hyderabad, where they've changed the way they use the water. They've mapped the monsoon runoff and managed to trap it in underground reservoirs so that they can use it through the year. And that works in some places, but the problem is with the climate crisis, that's absolutely changing the monsoon patterns. So instead of kind of having some sort of reliability as to when the water will come, you don't have that anymore. And so you can plant your crops and then find them devastated by drought, or you can wait for the rains and then find, you've left it too late and you've got nothing. Um, and sometimes they're flooded and washed away. And this is an absolutely huge problem, which India has, several kind of wild, huge kind of infrastructure plans to solve. But realistically, on the time frame, it's looking doubtful. And a lot of the ways they're planning to solve it rely on river flows and streams, which are heavily impacted again by the climate crisis. It's a similar sort of situation in China, where the north is really suffering from drought, terrible drought. Last year they had extreme drought, which hit agriculture and sent food prices soaring. And they had at least 25 major storms that affected agriculture as well. I mean, the same with the US, right? Seen absolutely terrible droughts
Mm-hmm.
hitting the bread baskets of the US.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, I mean, I don't think these are going to recede. We will continue, I fear, to have either not enough water because of drought or too much water because of record hurricane wind, like hurricanes or just floods. Um, as the glaciers melt, there may be floods and then nothing when the glaciers are gone.
Mhm.
So my question is, given these major agricultural catastrophes in our major growing regions around the world that are likely to continue, how do we feed everyone on the planet on an ongoing basis? How do we avoid reaching at some point like a genuine insufficiency, not a distribution problem, but a genuine insufficiency of food, which will lead to mass starvation?
Yeah, well, the whole of the food production system is going to have to change because it's completely unsustainable. Many of the world's biggest bread baskets or rice baskets or whatever are in places that are being massively impacted already by climate change. Um, but also, you know, the way we farm, the kinds of diets we eat is going to have to change. We are going to have to move to a predominantly plant based diet, which is, the livestock industry and dairy is responsible for more than 90% of deforestation around the world. It's linked to huge nitrogen emissions. It's a massive contributor to greenhouse gases, to climate change. It's also, very bad for our health. People who are eating a lot of meat and dairy um, are suffering in the obesity crisis, and strokes, heart disease, all of these things, cancers. We need to move much more to a predominantly plant based diet. It doesn't mean we have to give up meat, but it means we need to eat much less meat and dairy. Now, what that will do immediately is free up huge amounts more land, which is much better for us and for the environment, and means that we will have enough land to grow. But also, you know, the types of crops we grow and where we grow them is going to shift north, like everything is shifting. And I've been to places in Italy, for example. They've moving from wheat and olives and vineyards to, well, one is moving to lavender because it's more tolerant uh, of the kind of climate that they have there at that point. Others they're changing what they're growing in southern England. We're now growing, producing award-winning wines. You wouldn't have believed that. Whereas in France and Spain and Italy, the wines are declining massively in value because the harvests have been hit so badly. So we're already seeing dramatic shifts in what can be grown, where, and how. But we're also going to start seeing novel ways of growing and novel types. So the most sustainable livestock for me is actually insects. We're going to see much more insect farming. Even many of the crops that we grow, the soy, is fed to our livestock, fed to cattle. If they are fed instead insects, for example, that immediately reduces the land use required to feed cattle. It can also be, used in processed foods like burgers and sausages and all of those sorts of things. We're also going to be looking at other types of novel foods, like types of seaweeds and algae, other types of algae, fermented foods that require less land to grow on and are just intrinsically, less polluting, more sustainable for our environment. And we're going to change the way we grow crops. So, for example, some places are too arid to grow crops already. But then if you grow, so vegetables particularly, can be grown in closed greenhouses where the water is, the drip irrigation is kind of circulated within, um, and the temperature is reduced using renewable powered electricity and so on. So you can still produce, and I've been to tomato farms in places where you think nothing can grow here, but it does, because you produce these special environments in that way, and they have really great crops. So that is possible. At the moment, farm workers in parts of Asia are, they're already living in places that are essentially unlivable, and they're working at night with head torches because it's just too hot during the day. It's not, you would expire, you would die of heat exhaustion, as construction workers are dying in the Middle East, in Dubai or Kuwait or wherever. So that some of that work can be mechanized and done by robots when conditions are not, when it's there's not drought, it's just too hot for people, for farm laborers to live there. That can be mechanized, because plants and vegetables can tolerate conditions that we mammals cannot. But we are going to see a massive shift in how and what we eat, for sure, and where it's grown.
All right. The problem that I have with this conversation is that every time you answer a question, that leads to 5 more or 10 more questions that I want to ask. So I have more questions now than I ever did, but I want to respect your time. So I'll ask just one more. Um, uh, what can people do? Like what's it's one thing to we've talked a lot so far about learning about what's going to happen and what can or should be done, sort of in the abstract. Uh, for someone that has listened to our conversation or has read your book, what actions can we take to prepare for the nomad century?
Well, so, individually, we don't have that much agency over the world. We can't change the global climate or anything like that. There are lots of things that we can do. So, for a start, you need to recognize that you're living in a much more dangerous world. What is your plan of, should disaster strike? I think everybody should have that sort of plan. If there is a sudden terrible storm where things are flooded and you have to evacuate, or there's a heat wave that's so severe it leads to urban fires, you have to leave. Where would you go? Do you have fresh water? Do you have battery packs? Do you have the phone numbers of people that you need? Do you have a bag of essentials? Do you have a plan? start thinking about things like that. We all need to have a plan, because we are living in a more dangerous, volatile world. But also, you know, when the climate changes, that's a change fundamentally to our lives, to how we live, because everything is built on the climate. And so we need to recognize that we are living in the post climate change world, and that changes business decisions. It changes, where you decide to buy a house and get a mortgage, where you can, what the insurance is going to be. You know, are you going to get a car? Do you need a car? If you do, think about that. Think about the choices you're making with that, and have conversations. Talk to other people about the climate crisis, talk about migration, talk about human mobility, recognize that people have always moved, and what it means to have moved and left your house, and how you can carry on somewhere else, because it will either be you moving or it will be other people moving to your city. This is a city of turmoil, this time of turmoil. It is an upheaval this whole century. And we solve problems as humans, not by ourselves, not as individuals, but by cooperating collaboratively with each other. So strengthen your community. That's the most important thing any of us can do. Find strength in community, make those connections, um, feel that you are not alone, feel that you have other people with you, because there are so many good people out there who are all trying to get through these terrible challenges that we face, and they are the way forward. They're the people that you need, that strength in community. And when you feel strongly about things, we live in a democracy. Write to your MP, write to your politician, write to your city mayor about things that are not right. Take part, be an active participant in the lives and the city that you live in, and the future that we are all going to live in.
During the height of the pandemic, the slogan that was most commonly repeated was, "We are all in this together." And I think that is equally true to the century that's coming. Gaia Vince, author of Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape the World. Thank you so much for talking to me today on Podcast for Inquiry. If someone wants to find out more, do you have an online presence?
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Leslie. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I do. I have a website, wanderinggaia.com, and I'm Wandering Gaia on Blue Sky now, and various other places. So you can find me there.
All right. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.